When one considers America's hegemonic role in world affairs, of more immediate concern is the cost in both human life and capital that such involvement entails. Rarely, if ever, are the reasons and goals of these foreign escapades explicitly identified beyond empty platitudes about spreading democracy or liberating the oppressed, whatever those things mean. While Washington would prefer that every nation-state comprise itself of a government of, by, and for the people, this is neither pragmatic nor likely to ever happen. What's more is that the U.S. has favored despotic autocrats over those with popular support in the past, and even continues this contradictory practice today. America's historic support for Latin American regimes ranging from Batista to Pinochet are well known, as is its long-standing cooperation with the authoritarian House of Saud. In short, we can confidently rule out a purely altruistic desire to see democracy spread for the good of all mankind as the main impetus for American involvement abroad. Certainly, some ventures are driven by this notion, but not to the extent that those in the media or politics would have you believe. But this raises an important question. What are the strategic goals of American military and diplomatic involvement abroad? For what reason has America remained in the North Atlantic Treaty Organization despite the Warsaw Pact being non-existent for nearly 30 years now? Why does Washington keep an aircraft carrier group almost continuously patrolling the Persian Gulf, nearly 7,000 miles away from its home port? For what purpose do the 28,000 troops stationed in South Korea serve towards? And perhaps most importantly, how are all these disparate examples of American power projection related? Zbigniew Brzezinski attempts to answer these questions and more in his book, The Grand Chessboard. Besides having a hard-to-pronounce name, Brzezinski was a seasoned advisor and diplomat throughout the Cold War, serving in both the Johnson and Carter administrations as well as playing a founding role in the Trilateral Commission. His involvement in these ventures earned him respect transcending partisan lines, and his influence on American foreign policy during the Cold War is on par with Henry Kissinger and George Kennan. But Brzezinski's book is not about the Cold War, but that which followed it, the period of American global hegemony in what many call the quote-unquote unipolar moment. Though the book was written in 1997, we are still living in this unipolar moment, and thus the insights Brzezinski provides can help explain previous foreign policy decisions as much as they can foretell future ones. Being the experienced diplomat he is, Brzezinski's analysis is premised on many assumptions pertaining to the reader and their knowledge of geopolitical theories and concepts. Perhaps the most important of these is Halford John Mackinder's The Geographic Pivot Point of History, more commonly referred to simply as Heartland theory. Developed in the early 20th century, Mackinder's Heartland theory can be summarized in the following manner. He who commands Eastern Europe commands the Heartland. Who rules the Heartland commands the World Island. Who rules the World Island commands the world. Heartland theory thus emphasizes the importance of controlling the Heartland area of the World Island and by extension the division of global power in favor of that controlling group. Being that the World Island contains both the majority of the Earth's population and natural resources, a unified state or coalition in control of such a geographic axis would undoubtedly exercise hegemonic power on a global scale. Mackinder was well aware of the inherent disadvantages that island nations such as Great Britain possessed if a single polity were to dominate the world island. He thus emphasized the need for periphery nations to control what he called the inner and insular crescents of the world island. Though Mackinder thought simply controlling the crescents would not be enough to contain the eventual rise of a heartland power, controlling or dividing these zones would at least give the periphery nations bridgeheads from which to combat potential harnessers of the heartland. It is this premise of the heartland and the competition for the world island, or more specifically Eurasia, that is the focus of Brzezinski's work. While Mackinder published his geopolitical theory with the hopes of inspiring British policymakers to pursue a more involved, quote-unquote, continentalist approach toward the affairs of Central and Eastern Europe, Brzezinski instead uses Heartland theory to justify American involvement in the broader Eurasian theater. He asserts that America's role ought to be to prevent any one state or alliance from fully dominating Eurasia. If Mackinder's theory is to be believed, then failure to achieve this goal would lead to America being subordinated to whatever group controlled the world island and by extension the majority of the world's population and resources. American involvement is therefore imperative to not just maintaining Washington's short-term hegemony, but also a long-term autonomy as a sovereign nation. An observant viewer would note that despite not being mentioned thus far, the Heartland theory and its supporters are primarily concerned with Russia as the main contender capable of bringing Eurasia under its yoke. Though there have been concerns surrounding a possible German or Chinese Eurasian system, neither are as likely nor threatening as Russian domination of Eurasia would be. Indeed, Brzezinski's timing for the Grand Chessboard was not coincidental, as its main impetus for being written in 1997 was the collapse of the Soviet Union just 6 years prior. Seeing the opportunities that such an event held for America, it is within this context of Moscow's retraction of power that Brzezinski hoped to lay out Washington's geostrategic imperatives. The impact on global geopolitics that the Soviet Union's dissolution had cannot be overstated. Perhaps not recognized by those in the West as the monumental shift in power the collapse represented, Russian policymakers have come to view the Soviet Union's demise as the defining geopolitical moment of the 20th century. The Soviet Union's disintegration may have had the appearance of being an overnight phenomenon, but its decline as a superpower had been set in motion many decades prior. At the conclusion of the Chinese Civil War, Moscow's communist empire stretched from the Elbe River in central Germany to the far reaches of Siberia and down into Canton, China. Not since the rise of the Mongol Empire had a cohesive bloc controlled such a large swath of Eurasian territory. But following geopolitical maneuvers such as the Tito-Stalin split in 1948, as well as the Sino-Soviet split in 1956, Moscow's tenuous grip over their coalition had been reduced to its Warsaw Pact allies and a handful of eastern puppet states. After the comprehensive political reforms of the late 1980s, even these Warsaw Pact countries began to pursue foreign policies independent of the Kremlin, leaving the Soviets virtually alone in Eurasia. By the time the 1990s began, countries within the Union, such as the Baltic and Caucasian states, had begun declaring their independence, all but removing the facade of the once unified Soviet state. But it would be the formal discontinuation of the USSR that was the true apocalyptic scenario for Russian policymakers and military officials. With the signing of a piece of paper, the representatives of the now independent republics of Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia formally dissolved the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics and created the Commonwealth of Independent States. The disintegration was characterized by the three distinct areas wherein Russian territory retracted, namely Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, all loosely linked in the aforementioned Commonwealth of Independent States. Hoping to serve as a reformed version of the USSR, the CIS was too little and far too late to manage the geopolitical disaster Russia had just wrought upon itself. Moscow's intentions to remain geopolitically dominant in these regions were diminished when it became evident many, if not all, of these newly established republics wanted nothing to do with Russia and instead preferred their newfound autonomy. That these states would act to the chagrin of Moscow seems obvious now, but given the attitudes of those in the Kremlin at the time, particularly after Perestroika and Glasnost, a looser federation wherein Russia would hold a deferential position of overlordship was preferable to the outright destruction of the state as a whole. Thus, the CIS was more akin to an attempted rebranding of the Soviet Union than it was Russia decolonizing the empire simply for the benefit of its periphery republics. The immediate costs and prestige notwithstanding, the collapse also created new problems for Russia and accentuated existing ones. Perhaps the most pronounced of these issues was the problem of population and demographics. Per 1989 census data, the Soviet Union boasted a population of 286 million, bigger than the US and ranked third largest in the world at the time. After the Union's dissolution, Russia was reduced to just 139 million, more than halving its pre-collapse population. Additionally, not all of these 139 million were ethnic Russians, and neither were those outside the new borders uniformly non-Russian. Indeed, there existed substantial minority populations within the new Russia, and more importantly, a multitude of ethnic Russians who found themselves outside of Moscow's authority. While these Russian minorities would later be exploited to the Kremlin's advantage, particularly in the case of Ukraine, the loss of these ethnic Russians was, and still remains, a serious issue for Moscow. As one might expect, with the loss of such a key demographic and aggregate population, economic blowbacks occurred. The Soviet Union had suffered from stagnation long before its disintegration, but the new economic situation Russia found itself in was nothing short of catastrophic. The loss of the valuable Central Asian oil deposits nullified Russia's strategic edge over its former sphere of influence. Russia also lost some of its most valuable farmland, specifically in the Ukraine, which was considered the breadbasket of the former empire. Factor in the loss of its constituent republics and pure GDP figures, and one begins to see the complete economic crisis Russia had found itself in. The collapse also elongated the already enormous borders of Russia. Despite covering such a sprawling territory, the Soviet Union's borders were fixed on relatively short choke points and geographic features conducive to defensive posturing. Where these features did not exist, such as the North European plain, the Kremlin offset this exploitable weakness through the use of its satellite states in the Warsaw Pact, who would be expected to bear the brunt of a hypothetical NATO push eastward. These safety nets were all but upended during the disintegration, and Russia's borders grew by a considerable amount on both its Eastern Europe and Central Asian flanks. The elongated nature, coupled with the decrease in manpower reserves, meant that Russia would be forced to defend larger frontiers than before, with even fewer men than before. If these new frontiers weren't bad enough, the Soviet Union's overall capacity for power projection was severely hindered as a result of the loss of territory. Moscow lost sovereign control of its most important port in Crimea and was forced to sign a lease with the Ukrainian government to station ships there, meaning that Moscow would need to stay on good terms with Kiev to continue with such an arrangement for the foreseeable future. Russia also lost the Baltic states, reducing its valuable port in the Baltic to just Kaliningrad and St. Petersburg, with the former being a vulnerable exclave territory and the other suffering from frozen ports for the duration of the year. The enormous amount of lost territory in Central Asia also considerably reduced Russia's ability to project influence into Iran via the Caspian Sea and South Asia more broadly. In effect, the collapse of the Soviet Union was nothing short of totally catastrophic for the Russians. Conversely, the collapse presented an opportunity for American policymakers and industrialists to capitalize on the power vacuum left in the aforementioned areas of Soviet retraction. With their foremost ideological and geopolitical rival in disarray, the American foreign policy and national security priorities of dividing and conquering Asia could be realized to an ever greater extent than they had been before. It is thus within this context of Russia weakening and America strengthening that Brzezinski hoped to highlight the geostrategic goals for the unipolar world order that Washington hoped to dominate. And while the Russians would be severely weakened, negotiating this new world order would mean competing for influence in spaces previously dominated by Moscow with other countries, such as Turkey, Iran, and China. When considering the Eurasian landmass, Brzezinski divides the territory into four distinct zones. These four zones are the West, South, East, and Middle. These areas are not so much precise geographic zones, but are broad political and cultural areas around which Brzezinski hopes American foreign policymakers will pursue certain prescribed policies and doctrines. The first zone of interest is the West, which broadly encompasses most of continental Europe and the British Isles. It is not a coincidence that this zone is highlighted first, as it is the most important area for American policy regarding Eurasia. The openness of the great European plain toward the Russian heartland, as well as the historical and cultural links that bind America and Europe together, make this area of Eurasia most ripe for exploitation by Washington. Distinguished by its high level of development and multilateral cooperation, American policy in Europe is defined most by its interactions with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization and the European Union. Starting with NATO, Brzezinski emphasizes the importance of the Western Alliance not just for its original purpose of opposing Soviet aggression in the post-war era, but for the potential it has even in a time where there is no communist bloc to contain. Hastings Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, aptly summed up NATO's role when he said that the purpose of the alliance was to, quote, keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. This more or less continues to be NATO's de facto orientation today. By preventing neither the Russians nor the Germans from asserting themselves as the chief military power on the continent, America can carve out its own dominant space despite being a whole ocean away. While the organization does predicate on collective defense, a quick glance at the overall military budget of the alliance as well as the organization's posturing toward American security priorities reveals just how one-sided this brand of Atlanticism truly is. Despite this glaring dependency on Washington, the economies of Europe have benefited greatly from the presence of American troops and equipment on the continent. The alliance has provided an unprecedented level of integration and standardization among the militaries of Europe, and has ushered in a period of European stability not seen since the Roman Empire. Thus, the decision not to just maintain but expand NATO eastwards into the lands of the former Warsaw Pact and Soviet Union is essentially a no-brainer for Brzezinski and other policymakers wishing to preserve America's preeminent status on the continent. By expanding America's position as chief security arbiter in the former Soviet spheres of influence, Washington can contain future Russian desires to reassert itself in its near abroad. The expansion would also evolve NATO from a more Western-oriented alliance toward a truly continental outlook, further solidifying West Eurasia as America's most important bridgehead onto the world island. The unified security umbrella facilitated by the Americans has also allowed the Europeans to pursue political integration and economic partnership, exemplified most prominently in the European Union. Beginning as a European coal and steel community, by the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the EU had grown to consist of most of the major Western European countries. Like NATO, the preferred policy of Washington was to see the EU expand across the whole of the continent. The EU plays an essential role in facilitating American presence for two principal reasons, those being the neutralization of intra-European rivalries and the overall economic partnership the organization creates. Both of these reasons are manifested best through the special Franco-German relationship that Washington has helped develop since the end of the Second World War. Despite the historic rivalry, the economic links created with regards to industry and trade have made the Franco-German partnership the most viable foundation from which Washington can help build a unified European continental system. While they are both undoubtedly the strongest states on the continent, neither France nor Germany has the power to fully dominate Europe without external support from either Moscow or Washington. American efforts to further cultivate the unique link between Paris and Berlin therefore serve to the purpose of building a much-desired pan-European political identity, while also dissuading the two countries from flirting with a possible Paris-Moscow entente or Berlin-Moscow axis. In short, America's ability to keep and build upon its most important bridgehead is largely dependent on how well European efforts to integrate go. Despite issues arising with regards to southern European economic difficulties and Russian advances into Ukraine, the policy of overseeing this integration has been moving at a substantial pace. The shared Christian heritage and democratic leanings that bind America to Europe also means that Washington's presence in the region will be easier to maintain as opposed to other areas of Eurasia where there is less historical impetus for American involvement. However, the region remains geographically vulnerable and militarily neutered, especially when compared to the resurgent threat of Russian power in its near abroad regions of Eastern Europe. On some level, the battle lines have already been drawn by Moscow and Washington, and the Europeans are still figuring out their place in this new post-Soviet order. While most have committed to further European integration, there still exists resistance among those who would rather pursue nationalist policies. Even more problematic are those that want to pursue European integration independent of American leadership. Should the EU transition from an Atlanticist project to a purely continentalist outlook, Washington may have just unwittingly created yet another great power competitor in Eurasia. The effort of American West Eurasia is thus less a debate about hard power and where to allocate it, and much more a question of how effective American efforts to nudge the European sort of integration will be. Throughout the 20th century, the Balkans were a region of Europe marked by high levels of ethno-religious conflict and struggle while simultaneously being preyed upon by external great powers, hoping to utilize the infighting to their own advantage. Being the widest peninsula in all of Europe, the region was isolated from the maritime riches that helped develop many other parts of the continent. The result of this isolation and lack of wealth was the domination of its peoples by stronger powers such as the Austrians, Ottomans, and Russians. These competing political influences, coupled with the incredible ethnic, religious, and cultural diversity of the area, inevitably led to it being nicknamed the powder keg of Europe. It is therefore fitting that Brzezinski delineates a special portion of the southern world island as being part of the quote-unquote Eurasian Balkans. Just like the Balkans of 20th century Europe, this is an area that is distinguished by its high propensity for conflict and instability, especially with regards to the religious and ethnic diversity that is inherent in an area that sits at the crossroads of the Occident and Orient. The region is also geopolitically volatile, with key energy deposits and maritime choke points throughout. But what is crucial to understanding the Eurasian Balkans is the competition for influence and power that Washington must negotiate in the region. Despite the decline in influence here, Russia still retains considerable interest in the Central Asia portions of the region and has energy concerns in both the Caspian Sea basin and the broader Middle East. Iran and Turkey are also emerging as regional powers in their own limited yet expanding capacities. Both of these countries have imperial histories, and a reclamation of power and influence over their former holdings would be a natural restoration of their traditional geopolitical orientations. Outside this Eurasian Balkans lies a broader zone of instability, which is rife with conflicts and disputes between various powers inhabiting the region. With a litany of territorial disputes ranging from the Israel-Palestine conflict to the India-Pakistan rivalry, it is easy to see why this region is comparable to the powder keg of the 20th century Balkans. While a natural reaction to such a chaotic region is a desire not to get involved at all, this is not a viable option according to Brzezinski, and most advocates for American intervention would agree. The strategic oil deposits notwithstanding, Brzezinski asserts a lack of engagement from Washington would see the aforementioned powers of Russia, Turkey, and Iran vying for spheres of influence in a competition that would have cataclysmic results if an American security presence is absent. Washington's position must therefore be the creation and maintenance of a coalition of allies and partners in the region to establish stability and containment of certain actors. The more well-known American allies such as Israel and Saudi Arabia certainly will be part of this coalition, but Brzezinski specifically highlights two other key nations that he believes are crucial to seeing American designs on the region play out, those being Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan. Starting with Uzbekistan, a superficial look at the country might leave one confused as to how it factors into American efforts in the region. Landlocked and surrounded by larger powers such as Russia and Iran, the country inhabits the former Russian territories in Central Asia and is thus strategically isolated from American maritime power. Vulnerable as it may be, Uzbekistan drew the longest stick among its Central Asian neighbors during the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Created from the borders of the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic, Uzbekistan's advantage comes in the form of its population demographics. Despite being dwarfed in size by its northern neighbor Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan boasted a population of 21 million in 1991, around 5 million higher than Kazakhstan and easily above the rest of its Central Asian peers. Uzbekistan's borders are contorted in such a way that it possesses some of the most densely populated areas in all of Central Asia. The demography of this relatively large population is also very homogeneous, with the 1995 census estimating that around 71% of Uzbekistan citizens were ethnic Uzbeks. Considering the demographic heterogeneity of newly independent states such as Ukraine and Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan has been able to avoid the kinds of ethnic and nationalist problems that other post-Soviet countries have had to face. This demographic edge, coupled with Uzbekistan being shielded from Russia via Kazakhstan, has allowed the country to exercise an increased level of autonomy from Moscow's desired orientation of the region. Uzbekistan's ability to forge its own path independent of Moscow is something that Washington would obviously support. Aiding such an endeavor would guarantee Uzbekistan's sovereignty in the face of Russian encroachment while also setting an example for other Central Asian states, most of which still largely abide by the consensus laid out by Russia. However, supporting Uzbekistan is not as easy as it sounds. Being that the country is doubly landlocked and, in a region not exactly enthralled with American ideals, accessing and influencing the country is much easier said than done. What Washington needs is a lifeline, and that is where Azerbaijan comes in. Situated in the former Caucasus territories of the Soviet Union, Azerbaijan is a small but geopolitically significant state. Sharing the Caspian Sea with Russia, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Iran, Azerbaijan is the only country upon which Washington can rely on access to Central Asian republics of the former Soviet space. All other avenues are impeded by countries unfriendly to America, and thus Azerbaijan is the designated conduit through which American influence goes in and Central Asian oil goes out. Like Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan gets its borders from its time as a Soviet Socialist Republic within the broader USSR. The location and allocation of these borders are crucial to understanding why American policymakers would value it as a strategic partner. Predicated on a good relationship with Georgia as well, American influence can infiltrate the Central Asian states by way of Turkey or the Black Sea and then through the Caucasus. Whether this influence is pipelines or military support, Azerbaijan is the only country through which these resources can reliably pass and is thus crucial to American power projection into the region. In summary, Brzezinski's recommended policy for America in the Eurasian Balkans is one of carefully undermining Russian power in its former Soviet territory while also dissuading encroachment from Iran or Turkey. Whereas Brzezinski emphasized multilateralism in West Eurasia, he instead advocates for bilateral relationships with Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan in particular. These are not the only countries of concern, of course, but they are considered strategic imperatives if America is to keep this part of Eurasia divided in such a way that Washington remains preeminent. In contrast to Washington's policy in West Eurasia is that the Eurasian Balkans are not a place where America can oversee the kind of integration and unification it is pushing for with NATO and the EU. America's role here is instead that of a divider, not a unifier, and orienting toward this role while still maintaining its position in Europe will undoubtedly prove challenging for American policymakers. Only a steady hand and a disciplined approach will yield results in this powder keg region of Eurasia. America's role in East Eurasia is much narrower in scope than its position in both West or South Eurasia. While the two prior regions feature grand strategy goals ranging from the creation of a supranational European state to the building of a coalition to resist Russian reassertion in its near abroad, American geostrategic goals center on just two states in East Asia, those being China and Japan. As a result, Brzezinski's outlined role for America in the Far East of Eurasia is not that of a unifier or divider, but that of a balancer. In particular, he posits that America must simultaneously balance its security commitments to the various nation-states of the region while also negotiating and accommodating the rising power that is the People's Republic of China. How Washington handles this delicate balancing act will determine whether or not it can successfully retain its most vulnerable bridgehead onto the world island. The vulnerability of the Far Eastern bridgehead cannot be overstated either. If Washington were to lose its position in South Korea, then its options for engagement with the Far East would be reduced to purely maritime orientation. While such a posture could yield results in the form of a containment-style policy, this is not the path that Brzezinski recommends for America. American engagement in this region of Eurasia must be done with the understanding and acknowledgement of China's historic role as the region's dominant power and its geopolitical center of gravity. Despite periods of factionalism and recent subjugation by Western powers, China has more often than not been the regional hegemon of Eastern Eurasia. Despite this historical trend, the post-World War II order does not reflect this, and the breakup of the Soviet Union has not helped to restore China to its deserved standing in the world either. From Kashmir to Vladivostok and everything in between, China's claims and ambitions on its frontiers are not recognized by Washington, nor are they even given a chance for accommodation. For Brzezinski, this is a situation that is untenable for both sides. China cannot simultaneously grow to become the world's largest economy while at the same time lacking the geopolitical influence and power that such a heavyweight position ought to entail. Conversely, American policymakers cannot hope to build a stable Eurasian security network while at the same time denying China a sphere of influence in its own backyard. Both of these positions must be juggled on top of America's existing partnership with countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and in particular, Japan. Brzezinski's answer to these troubling contradictions is for Washington to engage with China in a strategic accommodation for influence. His reasoning for this proposal is based on the historical relationship the two countries have shared while also taking into consideration the future power that Beijing will eventually wield, both economically and militarily. Historically, Sino-American relations have been rather warm, at least by comparison with other Western powers. At the height of China's humiliation by Western powers in 1899, it was the Americans that demanded that an open-door policy be enforced with regards to trading and economic interests in the country, a clear rebuke of the other colonial powers' attempts at subverting China's economic sovereignty. Additionally, America was a staunch ally of the Chinese during World War II, and it was the Nixon administration that orchestrated the Sino-Soviet split. In short, there is most definitely a historical precedent for Sino-American partnership despite the perceived cultural and ideological differences. Beyond historical precedent, Brzezinski asserts that leveraging America's current geopolitical position in the region could allow it to exact concessions in the form of domestic political reforms. By utilizing the precedent of the Hong Kong transfer and the One China, Two Systems model, Brzezinski floats the possibility of Taiwan rejoining the PRC if Beijing institutes some form of federalism or democratic pluralism. The idea is that China can be coaxed into liberalization if certain geopolitical goals are solicited in exchange. Brzezinski also notes that China and America share many common geostrategic goals and imperatives, particularly ones that fly in the face of Russian Eurasian designs. Chinese interest in an independent Central Asia, as well as its need for Middle Eastern oil, are both geopolitical imperatives that are shared with the Americans. Cooperation between Washington and Beijing ought to be a natural partnership of mutual benefit, and it is precisely this that Brzezinski advocates for policymakers to establish. Failure to build this partnership would not only end any further expansion of the East Asia bridgehead, but would also have the adverse effect of driving the Chinese toward adversarial countries such as Iran and Russia. If the U.S. pursues a policy of inhibiting Chinese geostrategic goals while doing the same to Russia or Iran, then an informal alliance of convenience is well within the interests of all parties involved. While each of these countries might be enough for Washington to handle independently, the creation of such an anti-hegemonic coalition would spell disaster for American attempts at building a cohesive Eurasian security network. For better or for worse, a substantive Sino-American partnership must be forged if Washington hopes to remain preeminent in Eurasia. Juxtaposed next to this need for Chinese cooperation is the status of Japan within the American Eurasian framework. Barred from maintaining an actionable military and facing cold relations with its nearest neighbors, Japan's position is essentially that of an American protectorate. But Japan is anything but a typical protectorate. Its economy far exceeds most others, and yet its defense is totally bankrolled by the Americans. For Washington, this is a relationship that must continue if it is to maintain the East Asian bridgehead. If Japan were to remilitarize, it would not only make the country less dependent on American power, but it would have the potential of causing conflict with other East Asian states, all of which have experienced Japanese militarism firsthand. But what exactly is Japan's role in East Eurasia then? If its defense is outsourced to Washington, then it has little means by which to independently engage with potential security challenges posed by China or North Korea. Its frosty history with its neighbors also leaves little in the way of potential spheres of influence as a regional power. Brzezinski suggests that Japan pursue an international role rather than the regional one. Brzezinski doesn't specify whether this role will be in investments or in humanitarian efforts, but instead asserts that this is the preferred way Japan would behave if it abided by the American designs for East Asia. Brzezinski even goes as far as to claim that Japan ought to behave more like Canada in its foreign policy orientation. This desire to see Japan out of the way in East Asia says far more about Washington's geostrategic limitations than it does about Tokyo's. That Brzezinski thinks Japan, an ancient civilization and advanced society, ought to behave more like America's northern protectorate of 37 million is indicative of Washington's suspicion toward the Japanese and the liability they pose to American power in East Asia. While Japan does serve a role as an unsinkable aircraft carrier off East Asia's flank, its orientation as a maritime power inherently puts its interests into conflict with that of the United States. Washington may guarantee Tokyo's secure access to maritime trade now, but if Japan were to rearm, they would no longer be dependent on the Americans to guarantee their security. Even more concerning is the possibility of a potential partnership between Japan and China that would see Tokyo sidelining the Americans in favor of East Asian cooperation. In short, the Japanese must continue to be subordinated within the American sphere of influence if Washington wishes to secure a lasting partnership with China. Any Japanese outward influence must therefore be passive in nature and directed towards areas inconsequential to American strategy in East Eurasia. However, of all Brzezinski's positions, this belief that Japan will simply continue to acquiesce its security needs to America is perhaps his most overly optimistic position. Whether by nationalist demands or by a need to combat growing Korean and Chinese militarism, Japan's rearmament is essentially guaranteed so long as Washington is unable to forge a binding geopolitical accommodation with Beijing. America's position in East Asia is thus tied twofold to its ability to negotiate the rise of China. First with China itself, then with Japan's own security needs. America's policymakers must find a way to secure its most vulnerable bridgehead on Eurasia. Success would yield a comprehensive Eurasian security system, while failure would reduce American power on Eurasia to just NATO and a hodgepodge collection of Middle Eastern allies. Despite being written 23 years ago, much of what Brzezinski advocated for in the Grand Chessboard has been achieved or at least attempted. The eastward expansion of NATO, American involvement in the Middle East, and attempted engagements with China have all been implemented with varying degrees of success. It is, however, not without its faults. In hindsight, some of the policies Brzezinski advocated for seem to have decisively failed. His belief that China would simply acquiesce its authoritarian system in favor of paltry geopolitical objectives, as well as his hope for a reconciliatory Russia, are just a few examples of his abundant overconfidence in America's ability to enforce his will onto all of Eurasia. Even Brzezinski himself is aware of this, as he added an epilogue to the 2016 version of the book, wherein he decries the forces of non-interventionist nationalism that have come to grip not just Europe, but the American heartland itself. But these imprecise predictions or overconfidence in the American neoliberal model should not be held against him. After all, his book was not so much a concrete forecast, but more of a set of goals and objectives he felt necessary for American decision-making elite to pursue. While these objectives would be pursued by establishment policymakers, the unforeseen reactionary forces from both the left and the right would hinder or even reverse the course of these prescribed Eurasian policies. Add to the mix the geopolitical maneuvers by states like Russia, China, and Iran, and the odds of creating a Eurasian security network became all the steeper. In effect, the Grand Chessboard is a look into the grand strategy of Washington in its infancy of its unipolar moment. It should be no surprise that in the period between the Soviet Union's collapse and 9/11 that American policymakers would view Eurasian hegemony as their final frontier. The optimism of the Cold War victory was as much an influence on Brzezinski as his analysis of American geopolitical capabilities were. And while the orientation of American foreign policy has faltered in bulk at challenges both at home and abroad, this commitment to preserving the unipolar moment is by no means over. There still exists significant groups on both sides of the political divide that wish to see this kind of foreign policy as described in the book. Mr. Brzezinski may have died in 2017, but his works and theories regarding American geopolitical ambitions in Eurasia will remain relevant as long as there are policymakers aimed to preserve American global hegemony. Whether or not this legacy proves to be momentary or immortal remains to be seen. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a like as well as a comment down below. If you enjoy this style of content, I will be making more videos like this, so please consider subscribing. Anyways, my name is American Satrap. So long and take care.